Having faith is the only way to see clearly for anything in life. Somebody could say something an infinite number of times, but if you choose to believe that that person's lying, you won't ever truly understand or believe what they're saying. It happens a lot as a kid where someone might say something, or where I might say something and people don't believe me, and they say, prove it. It's such a weird thing to hear, and I know at that point, their mind won't truly be open to the possibility that I'm telling the truth, no matter how much I try to persuade them. Even if they have some proof in front of them, if they don't have faith, or if they choose to not to believe me, their mind will close off the possibility that the truth is being told, and the thought of it is basically vanished in their heads. Their new sole purpose is to prove me wrong, even if it's in a lighthearted way. Once their mind is closed off, it takes a lot of help and persuasion to open it back up. They shouldn't really need proof, though. They should just have trust and faith that I'm telling the truth. This is what happened to Jesus in the Portico of Solomon. As he was walking along, people gathered around him and basically said, prove it to him about being the Messiah. Although signs had pointed to him being the Son of God, or as he says in the end, bringing it a step further, the same as God, they made the choice not to believe the signs. Religion and life are all about belief and faith, and it's not exactly believing if something has been proven completely. Faith is all about a little bit of risk, and if your risk pays off, really good things can happen. As Jesus says in the gospel excerpt from today, my sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. As I've said a few times already, having faith and believing is a choice. You can choose to have an open mind, or you can choose to keep it closed. Now, of course, this doesn't mean to just believe everything people say, but just to be mindful that sometimes faith can do great things for not only you, but also the people around you.
In the gospel, it speaks about how people asked Jesus over and over if he was the Messiah. Jesus had told them before that he was the Messiah, but they didn't believe him, so he stopped trying to convince them, and he focused on the people he could convince and the people he already had. There are many possible reasons why some people didn't believe him, but one of them is that they were comfortable in their lives. They were fine with the way things were, and they didn't want someone to come in and change that. About 4 years ago, there was a 16-year-old girl in Pakistan. Now, in Pakistan, most girls aren't even educated, and boys are usually only educated on the Quran. But this girl believed in women's rights and the power of education. So she began to go to her father's school, and after that, many other girls began to go to school as well. But the Taliban didn't like what this girl was doing. They didn't like it because it was a change. The Taliban were comfortable. They liked being in power, and they didn't want that to change. Unfortunately, they were so afraid that they did something awful. When this girl was on the bus coming home from school, a man stood in the road, so the bus stopped. The man got onto the bus with a gun in his hand and said, "Who is Malala?" All the girls looked at her, and then he fired 3 bullets at her. This girl's name is Malala Yousafzai. After this, she moved to Britain, where she won a Nobel Peace Prize, and she continues to fight for women's rights and education for all. The Taliban shot at her because they were afraid of what she could do and what the education she was trying to give people could do. Now, Malala also has a side of the story. She knew the risks of what she was doing and what she was standing up for, and she took the chance. But she also picked her battles. Malala was smart and knew that she couldn't convince the Taliban that what they were doing was wrong. She knew they were too stuck in their ways. So instead, she tried to share her point of view with others who believed in her cause and those who had not yet made up their minds. She knew if she was going to fight against the Taliban, she couldn't just run in on her own with no army. So she shared her ideas and views with others, and she gained an army. But instead of fighting with weapons like the Taliban, she fought with education, and Malala continues that fight wherever she goes. In the gospel, the people at the temple didn't want to believe that Jesus was the Messiah because they didn't want him to change anything for the worse for them. Much like how the Taliban were afraid that Malala could be right about women's rights and education because it could mean that they would no longer be in power. And Jesus knew that he couldn't convince the people at the temple that he was the Messiah, so he decided to try and convince others that he was the Messiah. And Malala realized she couldn't convince the Taliban that they were wrong, so she focused on those who weren't sure yet. In both cases, Jesus and Malala couldn't convince those who didn't believe, so they focused on the people they could convince and those they already had, and that's how they built their armies of believers.